Welcome back to Beyond the Comfort Zone Talking Shit with King Cambio.
Hey, glad to be here. Today we are really getting into something critical. We're doing a deep dive into the future of architectural practice.
We are, and our source material for this is the Daily Interdisciplinary Mentorship Brief. This one's from Monday, December 22, 2025, and it comes from the services of King Cambio PS Architecture.
And this is, it's a really crucial document if you want to understand where the entire industry is heading. It's not just a trend piece.
No, not at all. And our mission today, it isn't just to, summarize what's in it. We want to internalize the core professional challenge it lays out for the next decade.
Right. And the brief basically posits that architecture is, well, it's fundamentally splitting into two critical intersecting domains.
Two domains that both demand mastery. You can't just pick one.
Exactly. You have to master what already exists.
Right.
That's the whole challenge of adaptive reuse and carbon accountability.
And at the same time, you have to master the physical infrastructure of the future. And that means digital infrastructure and data center urbanism.
It's a challenge that's all about dualities, isn't it? The past and the future, the tangible stuff you can touch and the invisible systems.
So the goal of this deep dive is to figure out how we extract the most future value from what's already built.
The reuse part, yeah.
While also, asserting some kind of architectural control over this just colossal wave of capital and energy that's pouring into computation.
Which is what's defining these new data center megastructures.
I have to say, I found the way they frame existing buildings really insightful. They're not just, static liabilities or old concrete shells.
No, the language is powerful.
The source calls them latent infrastructure, political artifacts, carbon banks, and professional exams in disguise. Let's stop there for a second. What does it even mean for a building to be a political artifact?
That's a really profound observation in the brief. When you look at a structure as a political artifact, it means its survival or, its demolition is all tied up in governance and public memory and economic policy.
So not just physics and materials.
Not at all. Think about historic preservation laws. They're intrinsically political, right? They constrain what developers can do. They mandate certain aesthetic outcomes. But it's not just historic buildings. Even, say, a non-historic mid-century office tower is political. The fact that it's sitting empty is a failure of zoning or market policy.
And its fate, whether it gets torn down or converted, that becomes a subject of intense debate.
An intense public and regulatory debate, a debate about its carbon footprint, its social usefulness, it's all political.
So reuse is inherently a political act. You're navigating municipal sentiment and policy levers, not just, calculating beam sizes.
You are. And that other term, professional exam in disguise, that one really hits home.
It sounds like every project is a test of everything you know.
Precisely. If a project were a blank slate, the exam would be much simpler. But adaptive reuse, it forces you to confront all the unknowns.
Hidden structural capacity, for one.
Right. Or dealing with 30 years of fragmented, layered code updates. And then there's the incredibly complex risk management you need when you're dealing with pre-existing conditions that are, frankly, poorly documented.
So it's testing your documentation skills, your code literacy, risk assessment, engineering fluency.
All at once. It's an integrative test that a new building project, it just doesn't require at that same level of depth.
This sets the stage perfectly then. We were talking about mastering matter on one hand and mastering invisible systems on the other.
That's the core of it. This deep dive is going to explore those two themes that now really define architectural leadership: sustainability through wisdom and reuse.
And power through computation, which means, designing the physical backbone of our entire digital age. Okay, let's unpack that first domain, this gravitational pull we're seeing toward existing buildings. The brief calls this Signal A.
Right. Signal A is this global reality that adaptive reuse is now officially surpassing new ground-up construction.
Surpassing it in terms of what volume?
In terms of volume and market capital in major global cities, this isn't a niche trend anymore. It's a tectonic shift.
So why the dramatic pivot? What's driving it?
The reasons are, they're fundamentally economic and environmental. On the economic side, you've just got immense cost pressure and a desperate need for speed.
It takes forever to get a new tower approved and built.
Exactly. You have to secure vast amounts of capital, navigate years of permitting, deal with volatile global supply chains for basic things like steel and concrete. It's a huge gamble.
Whereas reuse gives you an immediate structure to start with.
It's a massive time and cost saving right out of the gate. I mean, if you can retain, say, 60% of the structure, you are slashing the cost of foundations and the superstructure.
Which are the most expensive and carbon-intensive parts of any project.
By far. And beyond that, reuse projects almost always have a faster speed of delivery. You're eliminating or drastically reducing that whole site work and foundation phase.
And in the current economic climate, delivering a project 12 or even 18 months sooner is a huge financial advantage for a developer. They get the returns that much faster.
It's a game changer for them.
So we're seeing these conversions that used to be kind of niche, and now they're completely mainstream.
Oh, absolutely. It's a design necessity now, not just, a nice community benefit. Just think about the glut of vacant office space we have post-pandemic.
Every major downtown is dealing with it.
Right. So converting those empty commercial towers into high-density housing is happening everywhere. But it goes deeper than that.
What else are we seeing?
We're seeing these huge retail megastores, like big box stores, being converted into community colleges or specialized logistics hubs.
Wow. And I've heard about parking structures, too.
That's maybe the most structurally fascinating one. The transformation of these obsolete multi-story parking garages into last-mile logistics facilities or even vertical farming operations.
The structural complexity there has to be staggering. You're taking a building designed for the static load of cars
and converting it for dynamic truck access or, specialized heavy agricultural equipment.
Which is why the source material says that demolition is becoming a design failure.
It is. Tearing down a structure is basically an admission that the design process failed. It failed to find value or a second life for that latent asset. It is by far the most wasteful, carbon-intensive choice you can make.
And that wastefulness brings us directly to signal B, the carbon pressure point.
This is where the environmental impact becomes an immediate financial liability. It's not abstract anymore.
What does the brief say about how embodied carbon is influencing financing and project approvals?
So embodied carbon, that historical carbon footprint that's baked into the materials from day one, from extraction, manufacturing, transport, construction, it's no longer just a theoretical concept for a sustainability report.
Cool.
It is now a critical metric that influences whether a project gets permitted or, more importantly, funded.
And this is where it gets really interesting for professionals, right? The brief says that whole-life carbon analysis is now being requested by jurisdictions and, crucially, by major financial lenders.
And they're asking for it at the earliest design stages, sometimes before schematic design is even complete.
But why would a bank demand to see a carbon analysis?
Because they're assessing risk. Plain and simple. Lenders see the writing on the wall when it comes to future climate policy. They're worried about getting stuck with stranded assets.
Meaning a building that becomes a liability down the road.
Exactly. If they finance a new high-carbon building today, they're anticipating that in 10 or 15 years, that building might face heavy carbon taxes or be severely devalued simply because of its massive, upfront, embodied carbon footprint.
So they need proof that the building is going to remain viable for the entire term of the loan.
You got it. An architect isn't just pitching aesthetics anymore. You're pitching financial solvency against future regulatory risk.
And a whole-life carbon analysis, that takes everything into account.
Everything. It forces you to account for carbon emissions across all stages. Module A, which is product and construction. Module B, the use phase and operations. Module C, end of life and demolition. And critically, Module D, which is about recycled content and reuse potential.
And the data shows what?
The data is overwhelming. When you avoid that massive upfront carbon hit from Modules A1 to A5 materials in construction by reusing an existing structure, that building often outperforms a brand new high-efficiency build for the first 30 to 50 years of its life.
That's the core truth behind that phrase in the source. Why the greenest building already exists.
It is. The operational efficiency gains you get from a new HVAC system over, say, a decade, they simply cannot compensate for the immediate, devastating release of embodied carbon from demolishing the old structure and pouring all that new concrete.
Which means carbon literacy is now professional currency.
It's rapidly becoming that. You have to be able to quantify this stuff, to model it, to report it. If you can't credibly compare the embodied carbon savings of keeping a building versus the operational trade-offs of building new, you are basically excluding yourself from high-value projects where financing depends on ESG criteria.
This all leads perfectly into Signal C, which highlights the changing role of the structural engineer.
Right. They are no longer just, the people in the back room calculating columns and beams. They are now strategic consultants who are leading the reuse feasibility strategy.
They hold the keys to the carbon bank, as the brief puts it.
They really do. Structural engineers are now central to those very early feasibility decisions because they're the ones who can evaluate the latent capacity of the existing structure. They're looking at the original load paths and searching for structures that were often, frankly, over-conservatively designed and have a lot of built-in redundancy.
And the professional challenge mentioned is challenging over-conservatism. That's interesting. I mean, we're all taught to be safe, so legacy codes often have these very generous safety factors. How does an engineer responsibly challenge those to unlock more capacity?
This is where performance-based analysis comes in, or re-rating old structures, as the brief calls it. You're moving beyond the simple prescriptive tables in the code.
So instead of just assuming the worst.
Exactly. Instead of assuming the worst, engineers use advanced techniques. They might do non-destructive testing, like ground-penetrating radar, or take core samples to verify the actual concrete strength.
And then they model it.
Then they use finite element modeling, these incredibly sophisticated computer simulations, to precisely model how the existing structural frame will handle new point loads or, say, increased vibration from new mechanical systems.
And that level of digital modeling allows them to justify increased floor loads without having to do massive, expensive reinforcement.
Which saves both cost and carbon. They can prove the structural adequacy under current performance criteria, even if the building was designed under older, different prescriptive rules.
So the key insight here for an architect is that your partnership with a structural engineer is everything.
It's profound. Your structural partner's ability to understand what can remain is just as critical as your ability to design what must change. That partnership is what unlocks the immense value in a reuse project.
Okay, let's try to ground this in professional skill. Let's look at how the architectural registration exam, the ARE, reflects these real-world pressures.
It's a great lens to use.
The brief frames adaptive reuse as an exercise in assessing unknowns, which ties directly into uncertainty management. That's Q1 and Q7 in the brief.
Right. And uncertainty is, it is the default setting in any reuse project. You just don't know the full condition of the foundations or the quality of the original welds, or whether someone added non-structural elements that compromise a fire rating or a load path.
So the lesson from Q1 is that managing that uncertainty is a core professional skill.
It is. You have to be able to quantify and price that risk into the project from the very beginning.
And Q7 connects that uncertainty directly to liability. It highlights why documentation is so critical in reuse.
Because hidden conditions, things like undocumented alterations, asbestos, corroded structural members, they're liability bombs waiting to go off.
And the architect's job is to manage that.
Your responsibility is to manage the documentation process rigorously. That means meticulously recording what you find during exploratory demolition, logging every single assumption you make during the feasibility phase, and detailing your mitigation strategy.
Because if you rely on an undocumented assumption and it turns out to be wrong,
the liability rests squarely with your firm, no question.
Okay, let's move on to code evolution, Q2 and Q4. This feels like a common failure point for firms that are new to reuse projects.
It is.
The assumption that the building's original compliance is good enough. But the brief reminds us that the use of the building is what drives code compliance, not its age.
This is absolutely fundamental. If you convert, say, an R2 occupancy residential into an A3 occupancy, an assembly hall, or vice versa, you instantly trigger the need to meet the current edition of the building code for those specific use groups.
A change of occupancy is the big trigger.
It is, especially if it increases density or changes the risk profile, like converting an office to high-density residential. That immediately mandates new standards for means of egress, fire rating, vertical transportation, accessibility, the whole 9 yards.
So an architect almost have to be a historian of code changes, mapping the building's original design against today's much stricter requirements. And Q4 forces us to verify structural capacity.
Right. Even if the building's use doesn't change, but you introduce heavier mechanical equipment or maybe denser storage loads, you still have to prove the structure can handle it.
And what about things like seismic codes?
That's a huge one. Older structures were often designed with much less rigorous seismic or wind load requirements. You have to apply current lateral force requirements to an old structure. This often means you need to do targeted structural reinforcement in shear walls or diaphragm connections, even if the building looks perfectly sound on the surface.
Let's contrast systems and structure now, Q3 and Q5 in the brief.
Yeah.
Q3 is all about selective demolition using precision over brute force. Why is that surgical approach always preferred?
It's all about optimizing cost, time, and carbon. Selective demolition, it targets specific non-load-bearing elements like internal partitions, ceilings, obsolete finishes, while leaving the really expensive and carbon-intensive structure completely intact.
So you're reducing waste and
You're reducing the volume of material going to landfill, and you're minimizing the disruption to the retained structure. That reduces the chance of accidental damage that could trigger even more expensive repairs.
that precision is necessary because, as Q5 highlights, systems age faster than structure.
This is such a critical lesson in differential aging. I mean, a concrete structure can often last 100 years or more with minimal maintenance. Steel framing is similarly durable.
But the MEP systems.
The lifespan of MEP systems is dramatically shorter. Electrical wiring insulation degrades, you get pipe corrosion, and HVAC systems become hopelessly obsolete from an efficiency standpoint every 15 to 20 years.
So that means in a deep retrofit, you might keep 90% of the structure, but you're probably replacing 100% of the mechanical, electrical, and plumbing systems.
Almost certainly. They just don't meet current performance expectations for energy efficiency or indoor air quality or the capacity needed for modern digital demands.
Which creates its own challenges.
Exactly. This reality forces architects to design new, highly efficient systems into these old shells, which often require significant spatial reconfiguration. A modern air handling unit is a lot bigger than one from the 1970s, and the ductwork requirements are totally different.
Q6 ties this all back to the big picture. The definition of sustainability. We have to constantly juggle embodied versus operational carbon.
You do. You have to ask the question. If I save 1,000 metric tons of carbon by retaining the structure, that's the embodied savings, how many years of high-efficiency operation does it take to negate that saving if I build new?
And the answer is usually a long time.
Often 20, 30, or even 50 years. So reuse dramatically shifts the carbon impact temporally. We're banking huge immediate savings in carbon, which gives us decades of environmental runway. Sustainability for the modern architect has to be viewed across the full timeline of the building's expected life.
And finally, Q8 brings us to the wisdom of no. The ARD tests feasibility studies, forcing you to realize that not all buildings are actually worth saving.
And professional judgment is paramount here. There are situations where maybe there's severe structural damage or extensive environmental contamination or a floor plate that is just fundamentally incompatible with the new code-mandated use.
And the cost of fixing it becomes irrational.
The cost of remediation, upgrade, and adaptation becomes economically irrational. The moment the required upgrades for structure, life safety, and accessibility exceed the cost of efficient new construction, the answer has to be no.
So the exam tests your ability to synthesize all those factors.
And to advise the client responsibly, you have to prioritize long-term viability over, sentimental preservation. #tag3, real-world application and risk management.
Okay, let's move from theory to application.
Yeah.
The brief suggests a design assignment, the second life building exercise. This seems like it really crystallizes the constraints of reuse.
It's designed to force that synthesis, yeah. You take an obsolete common building type like a vacant suburban mall or a 1980s corporate office park or a standalone parking structure.
And you have to convert it
to a high-demand civic or residential use. But the constraints are the real test. You have to retain at least 60% of the structural elements, and you have to demonstrate a quantifiable carbon-saving strategy.
Which means your design is completely subservient to the existing conditions. You can't just slap a new skin on it and call it a day.
Not at all. You have to demonstrate legible code compliance in your drawings. For instance, converting a mall with its huge open floor plates and massive floor area into housing, which has a high occupant load and stringent fire separation requirements.
That's incredibly difficult.
It requires incredibly careful insertion of new vertical circulation cores and fire separations that actually respect the existing structural bays. The exercise demands innovation within existing boundaries. It's not about generating a new form, it's about surgically inserting new systems into old matter.
Okay, now for the high-stakes reality check. The CM engineering scenario. This one involves a discovery during the construction phase.
The nightmare scenario.
An office-to-housing conversion. Exploratory demo reveals widely corroded beams and undocumented structural alterations early in construction.
This is the moment when risk management becomes everything. You're past the initial feasibility studies, the financing is committed, and now a hidden condition threatens the entire project's viability.
The risks are immediate.
Immediate and severe. You're looking at catastrophic cost overruns, schedule delays measured in months, and the very real possibility of the lender just withdrawing financing because the risk profile of the project has fundamentally changed.
So the professional task defined by the brief is to execute a 5-step response plan. And it says this tests truthfulness more than creativity.
I love that line because you can't hide corroded beams from an engineer or a lender. You just can't.
So step 1.
Step 1. The team has to immediately evaluate repair versus replacement. The structural engineer gets in there, takes core samples, performs analysis to determine the extent of the corrosion. Can it be mitigated by, say, steel jacket reinforcement, or does the beam require complete removal and replacement?
Which would mean shoring up huge parts of the building.
A massive undertaking. Then, step 2. Quantify the precise impact. This is where the architect and the construction manager have to synthesize the data. What is the exact cost increase for materials and labor, and what is the schedule impact down to the week? This requires total honesty and rigor.
Okay, step 3.
Step 3 is immediate coordinated reanalysis. The structural engineer has to generate stamped drawings for the solution, whether it's repair or replacement, and the architect has to integrate that solution into the construction documents. This documentation is time-sensitive and absolutely critical for liability.
And step 4 is communicating all this bad news.
Clear communication of the risk to the lender and the insurer. You cannot bear this. Lenders hate surprises more than anything. They require certainty, and presenting a documented, quantified problem with a clear, engineered solution is infinitely better than trying to manage the problem in silence. This kind of transparency protects your reputation as a reliable risk manager.
And the final step, step 5.
Protect your own professional liability through meticulous documentation. Every email, every structural recalculation, all the cost impacts, stakeholder sign-offs, everything must be logged. This ensures the architect is operating as the objective coordinator and maintains a defense against claims that you failed to perform due diligence. This whole workflow is what defines professional maturity in reuse.
Let's finish this section by exploring the regulatory toolkit for reuse, specifically the International Existing Building Code, the IEBC.
Right. A lot of architects are fluent in the IBC, the International Building Code, but they treat the IEBC as this sort of secondary document, and they miss out on crucial flexibility.
So the IEBC is your best friend in a reuse project.
It really is. It's written specifically to give owners and designers flexible pathways that the standard, rigid IBC prescriptive path would immediately prohibit. The brief highlights 3 primary paths for compliance.
Walk us through those 3 paths: prescriptive, work area, and performance, and maybe give an example of how that performance path offers some creative trade-offs.
Sure, so the prescriptive path is the most rigid. If you use this path, every single new alteration has to meet the current code, essentially treating that part of the building as if it were new construction. It offers very little flexibility.
Okay.
The work area path is a bit more flexible. It divides the building into different work areas, say repair, alteration, addition. The compliance requirements are then scaled based on the scope of work just within that defined area.
But the performance path is the real game changer here.
Absolutely. The performance path allows for really creative solutions and trade-offs, as long as the overall level of safety is demonstrably equivalent to what the prescriptive code requires.
So you could, for example,
let's say you're converting an old structure and you just cannot meet the current code's requirement for a second means of egress because of existing structural limitations. The performance path might allow you to compensate for that deficiency by installing a much more robust, high-end fire suppression and alarm system, or by using significantly higher fire-rated materials for your walls and doors.
So you're trading a physical egress constraint for a technological safety enhancement.
Exactly. You're proving performance, not just ticking a box on a checklist. The major takeaway from the brief about the IEBC is that, 1, the change of occupancy is the single biggest trigger for upgrades, and 2, critically, ignorance removes options. If you don't understand the flexibility of the performance path, you might default to massive, expensive, and totally unnecessary structural demolition just because you didn't know you could use enhanced fire protection as a trade-off.
Wow. Okay, that was a really deep dive into mastering existing matter. Now we have to transition to the complete opposite extreme, the digital frontier.
Mastering invisible systems, specifically data center urbanism. We really have to shift our mindset here from preservation to power.
This is where the next decade's capital is flowing, isn't it?
It is. And we have to recognize that data centers are not just, oversized server rooms anymore. They are city-shaping megastructures. The demand being driven by large language models, AI training, massive cloud computing platforms. The scale is geometric.
So these hyperscale and edge data centers are now functionally equivalent to major civic infrastructure.
Totally. They rival hospitals, airports, major transit hubs in terms of their energy demand and their land use impact. This is far beyond the typical building footprint we're used to thinking about.
And if they're civic infrastructure, architects have to treat them that way.
That's the core architectural challenge the brief lays out. How can we design these data centers to be acceptable, even desirable neighbors, instead of just urban liabilities? Because right now, their reputation is often that of a fortress-like, resource-sucking block that contributes absolutely nothing to the urban realm.
And that perception is driven by what the brief calls the energy grid collision.
Right. The siting decisions for data centers, they're often clustered around key fiber optic hubs or old power plants, are now actively shaping regional energy policy.
The electrical load must be immense.
The sheer electrical load for a large hyperscale campus can be 100 megawatts or more. I mean, that requires massive upgrades to regional transmission lines and substations. It often diverts huge public resources towards supporting private computational growth. In many metro areas, data centers are the largest single consumers of electricity.
Which raises the critical expert question posed by the brief. Can architecture help reconcile computational growth with energy justice?
And that is a huge societal issue. If a community has to bear the cost of massive grid strain, increased utility rates because of infrastructure upgrades, maybe potential urban heat island effects, but they receive no tangible benefit, no jobs beyond a few maintenance staff, no public space, that is an energy justice failure.
So architecture's role becomes mitigating those impacts.
Mitigating impacts and potentially integrating services. And aesthetically, we're seeing this massive urban pushback against the standard design. Cities are actively rejecting the hidden boxes and the fortress-like facilities with those blank, sealed facades.
So what are they asking for instead?
Progressive jurisdictions are increasingly requiring genuine architectural quality. They want public interfaces. They're exploring mixed-use integration. The brief mentions this extreme paradox. What is architectural expression for a machine? A building with essentially no human occupants, designed primarily for uptime and security.
Yeah, the traditional architectural toolkit doesn't really apply. You can't design beautiful light and shadow play for a server rack.
No, but the goal is to design infrastructure people can understand and accept. The architecture has to communicate purpose and responsibility. It needs acoustic mitigation for the generators and cooling units. It needs to address the heat rejection systems visually.
Yeah.
The architecture becomes the intermediary between that powerful, invisible computational process and the visible physical city.
The brief mentions the Metropolitan AI and Digital Infrastructure Campus project. That sounds like the model for this new approach.
It is. It's a project that merges high-security data centers with research offices, grid infrastructure, and even integrated public education spaces.
So that demands that architects think way beyond the building envelope.
It requires a synthesis of energy systems, civil engineering, public administration. For example, a campus like that might be required to use its massive roof space for solar generation, or to integrate waste heat recovery systems that contribute warmth to nearby municipal buildings or residential developments. The architecture facilitates that integration, and it demonstrates the facility's role as a civic partner, not just a power sink. #5, essential technical mastery for digital architecture.
Okay, so just as adaptive reuse demands fluency in code and structure, data center design demands a technical mastery that gets deep into engineering. Let's look at the ARE focus questions here, starting with Q1 and Q5, which are about offsite systems.
Right. And data centers are completely 100% dependent on infrastructure capacity that is way beyond their property line.
Q1 stresses early utility engagement.
It's non-negotiable. If you secure a site based on zoning, but then the utility company informs you they can only guarantee 20 megawatts of service capacity in 5 years, and your tenant requires 80 megawatts in 3 years, the entire project is fatally compromised.
So the architect often has to lead that conversation with the utility long before typical construction would start. You have to understand concepts like available feeder capacity and substation upgrade schedules.
Absolutely. The architect has to anticipate infrastructure availability as the primary constraint, and that often drives the entire schedule. And Q5 addresses the second crucial offsite system, heat rejection.
Cooling capacity.
Cooling capacity drives the building form and the site design, especially in dense urban environments.
So what are the key differences in heat rejection systems that an architect needs to understand?
Well, you have to contrast traditional air cooling, evaporative cooling, and modern liquid cooling. Air cooling requires these vast mechanical yards for condensers, and it makes noise a major issue.
Evaporative cooling uses a lot of water.
Immense amounts of water, which raises huge sustainability concerns, especially in drought-prone areas. Liquid cooling, on the other hand, while it's highly efficient and compact, it introduces a lot of complexity with plumbing and leak detection, but it allows for much higher server density.
And the choice you make dictates the architecture. For instance, an air-cooled facility would need large, acoustically treated facades or roof systems.
Correct. And that impacts the urban heat island effect, which is a key zoning hurdle. An architect has to demonstrate how they're mitigating that thermal outflow, maybe through vertical green spaces or by integrating into district cooling systems. Understanding the physics of heat rejection dictates everything from facade porosity to site orientation.
Now, Q2 and Q4 focus on internal systems and structure, specifically load density. We're talking about floor loading that is completely different from a typical building.
Oh, completely. Data centers are defined by incredibly high-density racking, massive uninterrupted power supply batteries, UPS batteries, and heavy liquid cooling distribution units. A typical office building might handle, 50 pounds per square foot live load?
Right.
Data center floors often need to handle 150 to 250 pounds per square foot or more, and specifically very high point loads from the server racks.
Which completely changes the choice of structural system. You're probably looking at post-tension slabs or specialized reinforced concrete to handle that weight.
Absolutely. And the structural systems have to be selected not only for strength, but also for vibration isolation to protect the sensitive equipment and for maximizing clearance for all the underfloor systems. The architect has to fully integrate those equipment weight requirements very early in schematic design, or the structure will fail before the facility even opens.
And Q4 addresses reliability and redundancy. These are critical facilities. They cannot go down.
Which leads to the concept of N+1 redundancy.
Can you define N+1 and explain its implication for design?
Sure. N+1 is basically the industry standard for fault tolerance. N represents the exact number of units, whether it's generators, cooling towers, or UPS modules, that are required to operate the facility at its maximum load.
And the +1?
The +1 is a fully installed, fully functional spare unit that is standing by, ready to take over instantly if any single N unit fails or needs to be taken offline for maintenance.
That sounds incredibly expensive and space-intensive.
It is. Designing for N+1 means the architect has to plan space for nearly double the required mechanical and electrical systems. You need 2 redundant pathways for power, 2 redundant cooling loops, double the generator capacity, often in these vast acoustically dampened rooms. This redundancy profoundly affects the building's footprint, its height, its overall cost, but it is completely non-negotiable for clients who are demanding 99.999% uptime.
Q3 brings us back to the urban challenge, zoning and the community. Why is zoning so profound for data centers?
Because they are almost universally classified as high-impact conditional uses. This means they require special permission and a really rigorous public review process. They often have to go before planning commissions or city councils multiple times. You can't just build them by right.
And this public process is where NIMBYism, not in my backyard, gains traction.
Exactly. Neighbors and community groups can raise legitimate concerns about noise, visual impact, the energy draw, potential environmental hazards like diesel storage for backup generators. An architect who can successfully navigate these conditional use permits, who can address public concerns proactively, and communicate the facility's safety and economic benefits is far more valuable than one who just, designs a box and assumes it will get approved.
And finally, Q6 and Q7 underscore this non-negotiable need for precision and proof in data center construction. Q6 highlights the need for hyper-precise coordination drawings.
Clash detection is literally a life safety issue in these buildings. They are incredibly dense with multiple layers of structural support, massive cable trays, piping for liquid cooling, fire suppression systems, specialized security conduits, all packed into these tight spaces above and below the floor plate.
So any error found during construction is a disaster.
A pipe intersecting a main structural beam that leads to weeks of delay and catastrophic cost. Multidisciplinary responsibility for precise digital modeling is absolutely paramount.
Which leads to Q7. Performance has to be proven, not assumed, through functional testing and commissioning.
This is the critical handoff phase. You can't just connect the servers and hope it all works. Full integrated systems commissioning is required. This involves deliberately simulating failure modes, turning off a generator to ensure the UPS systems catch the load, testing a cooling failure to ensure the redundant system seamlessly takes over. This functional testing mitigates massive liability exposure for the entire design and construction team. The client has to see documented proof that the N+1 systems will work under duress before they will accept the fidelity. Tag 6, managing infrastructure risk.
Okay, let's shift to managing digital infrastructure risk. This parallels that corroded beam scenario we talked about earlier.
Right.
This is the CM engineering scenario involving an edge data center where the utility company just cannot guarantee power delivery by the required occupancy date.
This is a devastating systemic risk, and unfortunately it's becoming more and more common today because of grid overload and regulatory delays.
And if the financing and the tenant contracts are all tied to a specific date.
Say the AI company needs that compute capacity in Q1, and the utility pushes back the power delivery connection by 6 months. The core viability of the project is threatened. Infrastructure delays can absolutely kill perfect architecture.
The immediate risks would include massive financial penalties, losing your anchor tenants, and probably intense political scrutiny because these projects are often incentivized by local governments.
Exactly. So the professional team faces these immediate high-stakes decisions. The first one is evaluating phased occupancy. Can the client accept a smaller, lower power capacity initially, or is the full load completely non-negotiable?
And the second, much riskier decision is opting for temporary generation.
Right, bringing in huge banks of diesel or natural gas generators to run the facility until the utility connection is finally ready.
That sounds like an engineering and regulatory nightmare.
It is. And it adds this profound layer of regulatory complexity. You have to assess the permitting implications of those large backup systems. They require entirely new environmental permits related to emissions and noise, and rigorous fire safety approvals from the authority having jurisdiction, the AHJ. This can take months and often sparks community opposition because now the facility is operating on loud, temporary fossil fuels.
So the professional workflow outlined in the brief forces a rapid, structured response. What are the 4 immediate steps?
First, the team has to quantify the power demand versus the available capacity, and you have to treat the utility's delayed schedule as a firm, non-negotiable constraint. Second, you have to explore all interim power solutions, weighing the cost, the operational risks, and the required lifespan of that temporary generation.
Third step.
Third, and this is time critical, you have to coordinate approvals with the AHJ immediately for that interim plan. You need local buy-in on the temporary generation permits and the environmental compliance, or you risk being shut down before you even start.
And fourth,
adjust the construction sequencing. Maybe the team focuses on non-powered internal finishes or landscape elements while the grid connection is pending. And crucially, you meticulously document all decisions, especially the financial implications and the accepted risks, for all stakeholders, lenders, insurers, and the clients. That documentation proves proactive management in the face of an external failure.
Finally, let's revisit that civic data center design drill. This really feels like the ultimate synthesis challenge.
It is. The prompt is designed to test an architect's responsibility to the city, and the constraint is severe. No blank facades longer than 100 feet. This immediately forces the architect to rethink security and environmental integration. The architecture has to communicate purpose without exposing critical security risks.
So how do you communicate purpose in a building that has no windows and no traditional entry points?
You do it through materials, through texture, and by revealing the functional systems. The facade might articulate the massive air intake and heat rejection mechanisms, making that cooling process legible to the public. It might use patterns or texture or integrated public art that speaks to data processing or energy flow.
So you're making the invisible visible.
Exactly. And the design has to clearly demonstrate its grid connection and its redundancy, showing, perhaps through transparent viewing panels or external metering, how these systems are integrated into the city's power backbone. You are thereby making the invisible structure of computation visible and legible to the public.
This has been an incredibly complex and detailed deep dive. We've spanned 2 architectural worlds that seem almost diametrically opposed.
But they're fundamentally linked by resource management, aren't they?
They are.
We covered the mastery of existing physical matter, adaptive reuse, tapping the carbon bank, which requires the wisdom of code compliance and rigorous risk management for inherited structures.
And then we covered the mastery of invisible systems, digital infrastructure, data center urbanism, and the technical power required to build this highly resilient physical backbone for the AI economy.
And the brief's conclusion is just crystal clear. Professional mastery today requires this interdisciplinary fluency. The architect of the future cannot be a siloed esthetician. You have to be fluent in structural engineering, energy policy, utility capacity planning, municipal governance, financial risk assessment.
The age of architectural wisdom is truly beginning.
It is. The architects who will achieve professional dominance in the coming decades are the ones who can intelligently reuse structures, systems, and cities, while at the same time designing the next generation of critical digital infrastructure. They understand that maximizing the life of a single concrete beam and ensuring a 5 nines uptime for a server rack are really two sides of the same coin.
What coin is that?
Resource optimization under extreme constraints.
That dual capability. That's the professional differentiator. So as you finish this deep dive, we want to leave you with 2 provocative questions to reflect on. They're drawn straight from the KING-KAMBUF habit checklists for professional growth.
The first one is, how does invisible infrastructure shape visible cities? Think about the power plants, the fiber lines, and the server farms that are dictating where and how we build.
And the second question, what value already exists in the buildings I want to change? Always start with the assumption that the greenest, fastest solution is the one that's already standing.
Consider these questions as you assess your next project. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
We'll see you next time on Beyond the Comfort Zone Talking Shit with KING-KAMBUF.